It all started on a beautiful Tuesday. The light streamed through the lace curtains in my living room, casting intricate patterns on the coffee table where a book lay carelessly abandoned. I felt a pang of regret for leaving it out in the open. Its cover was striking, adorned with crimson lettering that boldly conveyed the yearnings of a middle-aged heart. Just then, Ethan entered the kitchen as I prepared tea. He wasn't supposed to be home, his college studies typically kept him out until late. Yet, there he stood, tall and slender, exuding a youthful curiosity that made him seem even younger than his 21. He paused at the table, his gaze locked onto the book I noticed from the handwriting. I caught the flicker of surprise crossing his bridge, or one side of his mouth lifted in what could only be interpreted as a grin. "Interesting choice," he remarked, lifting the book with a casual air. Yet his eyes sparkled with a hint of joy. Or perhaps something deeper. Heat surged up my neck. I pivoted to confront him and asserted that it was for academic purposes. "I am adjusting it for a client." "Indeed." He flipped through the pages, scanning a paragraph and closing it with a firm snap. "Appears more like a burst of creativity left a mere act of research." Chuckled. Yet it came across as too forced to be believable. "Refrain from forming opinions based solely on appearances." Yet his smile lingered, leaving me with the sense that he was passing judgment on more than just the book. He set it down, his fingertips linting the table for a moment longer than seen. "Sorry." Before he walked away. That table. Smirk in place. As the door to you clicked shut. I took a deep breath, trying to ease the anxiety tightening in my chest. I wasn't disturbed by the book itself, it was the way he looked at me. As if he perceived something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. That moment signified the beginning of an unexpected journey. I couldn't have stopped it even if I tried. Looking back, I wonder if I left the book there on purpose. If anything, I wanted him to find it and stare at me in a way that no one else had in years. My Deepening settled into a familiar pattern. Mornings began with a steamy cup of coffee, followed by hours spent crouched over manuscripts. My red pen circled faults and suggested changes. Being a freelance book editor has its advantages. It provides flexibility and privacy. But it also leaves me yearning for something I can't quite describe. Perhaps that explains my lack of attention to home that book on Tuesday. Ethan made his way back a few months prior. He required a place to reside as he completed his last year of college. And I found it impossible to refuse. The mansion loomed large, its emptiness palpable since my late husband Victor departed. I reassured myself that having someone around again was a positive change. Even if Ethan and I had never shared a deep bond. Our interactions were polite yet sparse. He was often absorbed in his studies or out with friends. I respected his need for space. And he reciprocated. However, after the book incident, an undeniable shift occurred. Ethan entered the next morning while I was seated at the dining table, poring over a particularly dull book on corporate leadership. He wore sweats and a t-shirt, his hair still tousled from sleep. I hardly looked up, expecting him to grab his cereal and disappear. But he remained stationary. He started discussing the book, leaning casually against the counter. I stood still, my pen hovering above the blank page. He shrugged. Yet a spark of intrigue flickered in his eyes. "I researched it. Appears to be different from your usual projects." I let out a frustrated sigh and set the pen aside. Not every pursuit can be thrilling, Ethan. It's just another task. Isn't it? He nodded but did not leave. Instead, he prepared a cup of coffee and settled down across from me. "So, what is it about?" I hesitated, contemplating how to respond. "It's a novel about relationships, focusing on connections later in life." "Huh?" He flashed a smile, causing my cheeks to flush with warmth. Yes, I said firmly, trying to bring the conversation to a close. But Ethan, undeterred after a long sip of coffee, remarked, I think people underestimate. The intricacies of relationships at any age were evident in his words. He maintained a casual demeanor, but the way he articulated his thoughts sent a shiver through me. I forced a smile, brushing off his comments as mere banter. Yet, as time went on, I noticed him observing me with increasing focus. One evening, I discovered him lounging on the couch, his laptop open, while my book lay on the coffee table. He wasn't reading it, but its presence felt deliberate, as if it were silently asking, Are you enjoying what I have to offer? I asked with a hint of humor as I stepped inside the room. He gazed up, unfazed. As I crossed my arms, I couldn't help but wonder if you had forgotten to include it again. This isn't quite the type of reading you prefer. Substance. Maybe I'm expanding my perspectives. His gaze locked onto mine. And in that fleeting moment, the air felt stifling. I tried to dismiss it, muttering something about him needing to expand his horizons. Yet the tension remained, if anything. It hung in the air, growing denser with every following touch. As the week drew to a close, thoughts of Ethan began to surface at the most unexpected moments. It was more than just his appearance. He possessed an undeniable charm, marked by his striking features and assured stance. Yet, it was his unexpected awareness that truly captivated me, the way he seemed to perceive details that eluded others. I remember the day he commented on my hair, which I had meticulously styled in hopes of standing out. As he walked by in the corridor, he casually said, Your hair looks nice like that, and in that moment, I felt seen. It was an unassuming remark, but it caught me by surprise. I expressed my gratitude, saying thank you. My voice, softer than I had intended, rendered these moments gaze deft and seemingly meaningless on the surface, yet they accumulated like droplets of water in a glass. I told myself it was nothing and that I was overthinking. But deep down I sensed something had changed between us. The house was not as quiet as it used to be. And it wasn't simply because Ethan was there, it was the unspoken words, the lingering stares, and the U.S. My heart raced when I caught his gaze. Ethan returned to the living room late one evening. The home was peaceful, with the only sound being the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. While working on my study, I felt the urge to take a break and grab some water. Passing by, I noticed a lamp's brightness illuminating his face as he sat on the couch, the book open in his hands. For a second, I stood still in the doorway, my breath seizing. He had not just been flicking through the pages he was reading, his forehead wrinkled with concentration. I could see a little movement in his lips as he silently murmured the words. He'd had this unconscious tendency since he was a youngster. Interesting bedtime story? I asked, leaning against the frame and attempting to appear casual. He looked up surprised, but soon recovered. It's unusual, he confessed, shutting the book while keeping his thumb between the pages. Much more honest than I expected. Honestly, I raised an eyebrow as I entered the room. He nodded, affirming, Yes. It's raw about allure and the unpleasant truths that remain unspoken. I settled into the armchair, facing him. I crossed my legs and feigned indifference to his remarks. The essence of remarkable prose, Ethan, lies in exploring the topics that instill fear in others. And you find yourself at ease with it all. His eyes locked onto mine, his voice probing. I hesitated. Understanding various perspectives is crucial, even if it feels unsettling for a moment. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. Then almost nonchalantly he asked, "Do you think people can truly feel that kind of enthusiasm? At any age?" I found myself taken by surprise, unsure of how to react. "I'm convinced that passion knows no limits." "What prompts your inquiry?" He shrugged, but his casualness carried an air of intention. "I'm simply curious, it's not a topic that typically crosses the minds of others my age." "You'd be surprised," I murmured, the word escaping my lips before I could stop it. Our eyes locked once more, and the atmosphere around us shifted, laden with an unspoken understanding. I quickly rose, brushing away non-existent lint from my sweatshirt. "Refrain from keeping yourself awake. It's already too late, you have class to attend in the morning. Sleep well, Eleanor," he murmured softly. Softly. His voice echoed through the corridor. The next day, I found myself replaying our conversation, dissecting his words and their possible meanings. Was he merely curious? Or was there something deeper behind his inquiries that night as I sat at my computer, trying to focus on a novel? A gentle knock echoed through the room, drawing my attention to the door. Ethan entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "I thought you could use a break," he remarked, and placed one beside me. "Thank you," I replied, taken aback. He leaned in, his hands poised with intention, within his pockets. "Could I inquire about something?" I nodded with a hint of apprehension. "What led you to select that book for your work? It seems you might have been able to share it with another person." I hesitated, contemplating the extent of my disclosure. "It's a matter of personal belief, I think. It's not just about the content, it's the underlying principle that everyone, no matter their age, deserves to see themselves reflected in stories that resonate." He said this while pulling out a chair to sit across from me. "But does that mean you see yourself in it?" I was taken aback by his question, momentarily unsure of how to reply. "I am convinced that there is a way for everyone to relate to some element of it." He did not press more, but the expression in his eyes told me he was dissatisfied with my response. Ethan's interest developed during the course of the next week. He began asking me questions about other works I'd worked on as well as my opinions on love and relationships. At first I attributed it to his curious nature, but as his queries got more precise, I couldn't deny the underlying sense of something more. One afternoon I saw him looking at me as I was reading on the terrace. He was supposed to be studying, but his textbook was neglected on his lap. When I glanced up, he didn't look away. "You're distracted," I added, attempting to maintain a light tone. Perhaps he conceded a faint smile, pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Is there something on your mind?" He hesitated before responding. "Do you ever consider starting over and meeting someone new?" The question was so unexpected that I had no idea how to answer. "That's complicated," I admitted. "Finally. Life is typically like that," he responded, rising and walking inside. Before I could finish speaking, as the days passed, I became more conscious of Ethan's presence. His inquiries, his glances, and the way he seemed to listen to everything I said. It was as if he was removing layers that I had not been aware were there, and I could not refute it. I didn't resent the attention. The air between us had been heated for days, but neither of us recognized it openly. The unsaid tension persisted like a static current throughout the home, rising stronger with each exchanged gaze. And snatched a moment. That Saturday I decided to do some long overdue library organizing. Books were dispersed throughout the shelf, a jumbled collection of old novels from college textbooks and different anthologies I'd accumulated throughout the years. I had just finished sorting a stack when Ethan stepped in barefoot and dressed casually in pants and a gray t-shirt. "Need help?" he offered with a casual tone. "Sure," I said, wiping a piece of hair from my face. "But I must tell you that this is a full-day project." "I've got time," he said, edging closer. We worked side by side for several hours, exchanging casual talk on everything from his academics to my editing tasks. The tension that had previously persisted in the air appeared to dissipate as we concentrated on the work at hand. It seemed nearly natural, the type of pleasant contact I had ceased anticipating. But the comfort did not last as I reached for a book on the high shelf. Ethan went forward to assist, his hand brushed against mine for longer than required. The warmth of his flesh jolted me, and I backed away as if scorched, holding the book to my breast. Sorry, he mumbled, his voice gentle and compassionate. It's all right, I answered hastily, turning aside to cover the color on my cheeks. But it wasn't okay, that little contact had reawakened something. I had frantically tried to ignore my pulse racing, my skin tingling, and every nerve in my body seemed to come alive as it hadn't in years since everything changed. Ethan became more attentive, seeking ways to be near me. He volunteered to assist with housework, gave me coffee in the mornings, and hung out in the kitchen while I cooked. His presence was both reassuring and unsettling, and I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. One evening I discovered him in the living room doodling in a notebook. I didn't realize you drew, I remarked, sitting on the arm of the couch. It's just a pastime, he explained, flipping the page so I couldn't see. Let me see, I teased while reaching for the notepad. He hesitated before handing it up, his countenance opaque. The illustrations were lovely portraits. Landscapes and moments are caught in subtle lines and shadows. But one sketch caused me to halt. It was a woman with her back turned and hair streaming over her shoulders. It's stunning, I remarked, running my fingertips along the edge of the page. It's you, he remarked gently. I looked up, gathering my breath, and he nodded, his gaze catching mine. I've been painting you for weeks, and you're inspirational. The space felt smaller, and the air was heavier. I returned the notepad, unsure of what to say. Thank you. My voice scarcely rose beyond a whisper. The days that followed were filled with intense emotion. I could not stop thinking about him. His touch, his words, and the way he looked at me made me feel like the only thing that mattered was simultaneously exhilarating and horrifying. One afternoon I resolved to face him, to stop whatever was going on. I found him in the kitchen before the situation escalated beyond control, leaning against the counter and holding a glass of water. Ethan, we need to talk, I murmured calmly despite the turmoil inside me. Okay, he responded, putting down the drink and giving me his whole attention. This, whatever it is, needs to stop it. It is inappropriate. He grimaced, his brows pulled together. I do not comprehend. What exactly are you talking about? You understand precisely what I am talking about. I spoke with a stronger tone than I intended. Appearance of the touches was everything. He moved closer, his expression softening. Eleanor, I won't do anything to you. I don't want my breath caught as he reached out and brushed stray hair off my face. If I'm incorrect, tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I should have pushed away and informed him he was mistaken, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me by leaning into his contact as if it had anticipated this moment all along. Ethan, I began. But any argument I had died on my lips as his fingers caressed my cheek was incorrect. I knew it was wrong. But as his lips touched mine, all of the reasons seemed to evaporate, replaced by a passion that devoured me when I eventually drew away. My head was filled with remorse, and I wanted this to never happen again. I said, my voice quivering. Why not? He inquired, his tone calm yet strong. Because it's not correct. So why didn't you stop me? I had no response, no resistance against the truth of his comments. I turned and went out of the room, But I knew it wasn't finished. Definitely not at the level of tension in the house that had escalated significantly. Every gaze, inadvertent touch, and word we shared seemed to have more weight than it should. I avoided being alone with Ethan whenever possible. But it didn't matter, his presence was omnipresent in my thoughts, dreams, and waking moments. The border was ultimately crossed on a wet evening. And water pelting at the windows broke the stillness as I sat in the kitchen drinking a drink of wine after a difficult day. My work had been rejected by a very demanding customer. And the weight of it was bearing down on me. I didn't hear Ethan enter until he was already standing at the doorway. "You okay?" he asked softly. I looked up surprised, but soon collected myself. "I'm all right, it's just been a hard day." He walked inside his socks, muffled his footsteps. Wanting to discuss it, I shook my head, hoping to evade his sight. "No, it is nothing." He did not depart. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his gaze fixed on mine. "You've been distant," he remarked. After a pause. "I've been busy," I said. But even though I could hear the untruth in my voice, he addressed Amara with a kind but stern tone. "Talk to me." I groaned and leaned back in my chair. "It's complex. Ethan's work life, everything seems so heavy nowadays." He stretched out and covered my hand. "You do not have to carry it alone." His touch was warm and anchoring. And I allowed myself to lean into it for a moment. I stated that I had been carrying things alone for quite some time. My voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to anymore," he whispered. Caressing my knuckles with his thumb, the words lingered between us, brimming with unspoken meaning. I glanced up at him. And for the first time I allowed myself to view him as a man rather than my stepson Ethan. I started. But he interrupted me. His voice was low and steady. "Tell me to go. And I will. But if you do not want me to, I will not." He didn't continue the phrase. And he didn't. The option was mine. And I knew exactly what I wanted, something I had desired for weeks but had been too terrified to express it. I did not tell him to go. The first kiss was cautious. A gentle kiss that sent chills down my spine. I backed away, scanning his eyes for doubt or hesitation. But there was none. He gazed at me with a confidence that startled and delighted me. When he kissed me again, it was deeper and more intense. His hands reached my waist, bringing me closer while the world outside faded away. My glass of wine spilled over, spreading crimson liquid all over the table. But none of us noticed. We didn't make it into the bedroom that night as we succumbed to the long simmering longing between us. The kitchen became our shelter. Secretly, the next morning I awoke in my own bed, recalling the events of the night before. My mind is reliving itself like a dream. But this wasn't a dream. The lingering warmth on my skin, the faint perfume of him on my pillow, it was all too real. I persuaded myself that it was a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness. That would never happen again. But as Ethan strolled into the kitchen, his hair moist from the shower and a little smile on his lips, I realized it wasn't that easy. "Morning," he remarked in a casual tone. "Morning," I said, my voice trembling. He leaned against the counter and watched me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Are we going to discuss last night?" "There's nothing to discuss," I responded hastily, returning my focus to the coffee pot. Eleanor's voice was faint, yet it held enough weight to make me halt. "Do not pretend it did not happen." I turned to face him with my arms crossed defensively. "What would you like me to say to Ethan, Leon? Was it a mistake that it cannot happen again? Was this an error?" he questioned, his gaze fixed on mine. I opened my lips to reply, but nothing came out. I had no idea how to respond because I knew it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had seemed inevitable over the following few days. We danced around each other, stuck in a state of yearning and denial, every touch, gaze, an accidental brush of flesh just fueled the flames. Ethan came to the doorway of my study one evening while I was working late. "Can I come inside?" inquired. I only nodded, unable to find my voice. He walked inside and closed the door behind him. "I can't stop thinking about you," he acknowledged, his voice low and full of passion. "Ethan, we cannot." "Why not?" he interjected, taking a step closer. "Because it's incorrect, because you are terrified of what others would think." "None of this matters to me. Eleanor. You are important," his words cut through my barriers. And before I could stop myself, I was back in his arms. This time there was no hesitancy or second-guessing. As the night progressed, the restrictions we had previously adhered to vanished completely. The days after that night were hazy with snatched moments and silent desire. What began as an impulsive choice, a kiss in the kitchen on a wet evening, grew into something none of us could control. Ethan and I were attracted together like magnets. The attraction was too powerful to resist. No matter how wrong it felt, we became masters of concealment. Our friendship remained in the shadows, concealed behind shuttered doors and murmured words when the home was vacant. We would meet in the quiet nooks where no one could interfere. My workplace became our refuge, a place where we could exist without being judged, at least for a short time. I'd sit at my desk, appearing to be productive while Ethan stood behind me, his hands softly resting on my shoulders. At times he would gently press his lips against my neck, causing shivers to run down my spine. Sometimes he'd kneel alongside me, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. As we spoke about everything and nothing, Ethan suggested we go for a drive on a particularly warm afternoon, somewhere away from here. He murmured, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. We found ourselves at a remote park on the outskirts of town where the trees formed a green canopy over us as we strolled hand in hand along the meandering trails of the world, which seemed distant and almost surreal. "Does this seem unusual to you?" I asked. I spoke in a barely audible whisper. He paused, turning to face me. "What do you mean by this?" I motioned between us, and the United States moved a step closer, his hands touching mine. "It feels like the most genuine thing I've ever experienced," his remarks dispelled my doubts, at least for the moment. We sat on a wooden bench, song filling the air, and he placed his arm over my shoulders. I lay my head on him, allowing myself to believe, even only briefly, that this was typical. Despite our best efforts to conceal our affair, cracks began to appear in our carefully crafted veneer. It began with Mrs. Whitmore, our excessively nosy neighbor, who had an amazing capacity to come at awkward moments. Ethan left the house for class one morning. She waved at him from her porch with a knowing smile. "Ethan seemed to be around a lot more these days," she said later when Ian ran into her at the grocery store. "He is such a dedicated stepson." Her words were benign, but how she uttered them, making my stomach turn. I smiled nicely and changed the subject, but the experience made me nervous. Then there was Ethan's best buddy, Ethan, who stopped over one evening to study. I remained out of their path, returning to my office, but I couldn't ignore the whispered talk that echoed through the walls. "You've been acting strangely lately," Ethan remarked. That Ethan's remark was too faint for me to hear, but whatever he said did not appear to satisfy Ethan. You can you tell me anything right now, Ethan? If something is going on?" Their chat came to an abrupt stop when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on my desk. A few minutes later, Ethan came in my doorway with his look opaque. "Is everything okay?" I inquired, trying to grin. "Yes," he said, though his tone was strained. Ethan is simply nosy. I didn't go any farther. But the strain in his voice stayed in the back of my mind. Our most adventurous encounter occurred one evening while I was scheduled to meet a customer at the library. The appointment was cancelled at the last minute. So I chose to stay and shop. The library had always been a safe haven for me. A place where I could immerse myself in the peaceful comfort of literature. I hadn't expected Ethan to show up. "What are you doing here?" I inquired. My tone a mixture of astonishment and excitement. "I was passing past," he replied with a sly grin. "I thought I would find you here." We walked through the aisles together. Our shoulders touching as we took books from the racks. He kissed me in a secluded corner of the library, hidden from view. His hands cradling my face while the outer world drifted away. "This is insane," I muttered against his lips. Maybe he murmured quietly. "But it's ours." As the weeks passed, the stakes rose. The more time we spent together, the more difficult it got to keep our emotions buried. Ethan didn't seem concerned about the hazard. But I couldn't ignore them. The worry of being detected hovered over me like a thundercloud, growing darker with each passing day. It wasn't only the worry of what others would do, it was the realization that this could not endure. Ethan was young. With his entire life ahead of him, I was not sure our age gap was more than a number. It was a divide that I knew we couldn't cross forever. However, for the time being, I cherished our shared moments. Treating them as precious, I promised myself that I would terminate it shortly. I'd figure out a way to let him go before it was too late. Ethan used his fingertips to trace circles on my arm one evening while we were intertwined on the couch. I do not want this to end," he replied gently. "Ethan," I started. But he cut me off. "I mean it, Eleanor. I understand it's difficult. But I don't care. I don't care about the rules or what others may think. I care about you." His words shattered something within me. I wanted to believe him and let myself fall fully. However, the voice of reason in my thoughts would not be muted. "I care about you too," I said, my voice wavering. "However, you are aware that this is not sustainable." "He will figure it out," continued his tone, determined. I wanted to trust him. But deep down I knew the truth. Our relationship was akin to a fire, intense, captivating, yet destined for extinguishment. The certainty of discovery stayed. And I have no interest in that. Like a shadow. But I told myself that we were cautious enough to prevent it. It wasn't simply the thought of other people finding out that worried me, it was the notion of what would happen to Ethan. And to us. If the delicate equilibrium we had maintained collapsed. The first break in our veneer appeared on an unremarkable afternoon. Mrs. Whitmore came to the door while I was in the kitchen making lunch. She seldom paid surprise visits. So her abrupt arrival made me nervous. "I just stopped by to return your pie plate," she replied with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "And to check in with you. Ethan's automobile has been around a lot lately. I hope he is not causing you too many problems." Her tone was nonchalant. But her comments included an undertone that made my stomach knot. "No problem at all," I responded, feigning a grin. "He is busy with school. But it is good to have him around," she said. Her gaze lingered on me for an uncomfortable moment before she handed me the plate and walked away. I shut the door behind me. My heart races with intensity. She possessed a fragment of knowledge. Maybe not the complete truth, but certainly sufficient. Later that evening, as Ethan and I sat in the living room with the television softly playing in the background, I shared the details of Mrs. Whitmore's visit, keen to gauge his response. "She's just nosy," he muttered, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Yet the tension in his shoulders betrayed his calm facade. "It's not just her, Ethan," I added, lowering my voice. "People are I'm beginning to realize that we can't continue down this path. He turned to me, his eyes shining with determination, and declared that he didn't care about the opinions of others. Eleanor, my feelings for you run deep. His remarks aimed to provide comfort. Yet they only heightened my anxiety. The situation took an unexpected turn when Ethan's close friend Ethan arrived unannounced one evening. I was engrossed in my studies when I caught the sound of their hushed, sincere voices drifting from the living room. Ethan observed. You've been performing. Strange fellow. Genuinely peculiar. What's going on? Ethan didn't say anything. Yet his tone carried a defensive edge. Be honest with me, Ethan. Is this concerning Eleanor? I nervously approached the door, hoping to hear glimpses of their conversation. What about her? Ethan inquired, his tone a blend of firmness and caution. I don't know, Ethan replied. You don't appear to be your usual self around her. It feels like there's something hidden beneath the surface. Ethan remained unresponsive, and the stillness lingered until Ethan let out a groan. If something is happening, just be careful. Individuals express their genuine feelings. The unraveling commenced when I received an offer for a position at a renowned publishing company in a different state. It was the opportunity one had longed for. Yet embracing it would require me to abandon everything, including Ethan. When I shared the news with him, his reaction was instantaneous. You're going? He asked, his tone sharp with disbelief. I haven't decided yet, I replied with a steady calmness. You are escaping, he asserted, standing and pacing the room. Ethan, this is my career, I explained. I'm struggling to make him understand the effort I've put into this. So where does that leave us? He insisted, his voice trembling. There cannot be an us, I replied softly. The atmosphere was filled with sharp and cutting words that created a divide between us. He gazed at me, his expression a blend of pain and anger. In the days that ensued, our conversations dwindled. And as our distance widened, the home grew increasingly cold and desolate. I dedicated my evenings to meticulously reviewing the details of the job offer, attempting to convince myself that it was the right choice. However, one night, as I was immersed in my work, Ethan appeared in the doorway. I will continue to stand by you, he stated, that his voice stayed steady, even though there was a storm brewing in his eyes. Ethan, please, I urged. But he merely shook his head in response. He declared that he was indifferent to its complexity. Eleanor, I love you. The words swept over me, overwhelming and undeniable. The weight of our situation held me back from confessing that I felt the same way. The pivotal moment came when I learned that Mrs. Whitmore had spoken with one of my clients during an unexpected encounter at the grocery store. In a casual phone conversation, my client mentioned that her stepson resides with her. She seemed captivated by your interaction. I suspended myself with my hands. I knew that the rumors would soon spread and expose our private information. When Ethan got home that evening, I laid it all out for him. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice trembling. It poses too great a risk. Eleanor, I don't care what others say, he added, his voice carried a sense of urgency. But I do, I replied. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I finally recognized the terror reflected in his eyes. He stepped nearer, his hands gently cradling my face as he whispered, I can't lose you. Never truly possessed me from the start. I whispered my words, striking deeper than I had meant, leaving both of us shattered in the wake of the confrontation. Ethan retreated to his room, leaving me to spend the night staring at the ceiling, lost in thoughts about how we had allowed things to spiral to this point. As dawn broke, I had reached my conclusion after a restless night. I made the choice to bring everything to a halt: the affair, the hidden truths, the fleeting moments that reignited my spirit after so long. It all needed to conclude. The danger loomed large, and the destruction we would unleash was far too grave. Ethan emerged from his room just as I finished preparing a cup of coffee. His hair was tousled, and the dark circles under his eyes mirrored my own fatigue. "We need to have a conversation," I responded. As I placed the cup down, I recalled his quiet words. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. "This cannot continue," I said, my hands trembling as I clenched them together. "It feels unjust for both of us." "Fair," he repeated, his tone laced with irritation. "Since when has this been about fairness?" "Ethan." "No, just leave Ethan alone," he insisted, his voice growing louder. I recognize that this may be unconventional, and I realize that many might not grasp the situation. But my focus isn't on them, it's on us. And his remarks, it stirred something profound inside me, a blend of longing and regret. Yet I refused to accept that there was no connection between us. I softly responded, my voice trembling. Acknowledging the mistake, his expression changed, and the anguish in his gaze struck me deeply. "You can't be serious," he replied, with a tremor in his voice. I complied. I was deceived even though my heart was crying out against it. I urged myself to say, "Ethan, it's time to let go and seek someone your age who can truly support you in living your life. The life you deserve." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get to judge what I deserve," he shouted, his voice overflowing with fury. I observed in despair as he hurried out of the house, the door crashing shut behind him. The silence that followed was overwhelming. For the first time in months, the home felt completely vacant. I attempted to focus on my tasks, yet my thoughts continually drifted back to Ethan, wondering where he had gone, what occupied his mind, and if I had truly made the right choice. Time dragged on, silence enveloping the space where his voice should have been. I fought against the urge to reach out to him, persuading myself that he required space to process everything. However, as darkness enveloped the night, my worries intensified. Just after midnight, the creak of the front door broke through my restless musings. I hurried into the living room, a wave of relief washing over me at the sight of Ethan. His shoulders slumped, and his expression bore the weight of exhaustion. "Where have you been?" I demanded, my voice revealing my anxiety. "Out," he said curtly, avoiding my gaze. "Ethan." I'm finished speaking," he interrupted, cutting me short. "I get it, Eleanor. You do not want this, you do not want me." His words pierced my heart, yet I held back from correcting him. How could I, having already made my decision, watch him walk past me directly to his room without uttering a word? The sound of his door closing felt like the final blow to our shared life. The days that followed were nothing short of terrible. Ethan seldom conversed with me, and when he did, his remarks were concise and direct, and distant. The home felt increasingly colder and emptier, as though life had been drained from it. I immersed myself in work, hoping it would serve as a distraction. Yet it proved futile. My thoughts were consumed by memories of him, his touch, his smile, the way he gazed at me as if I were everything. One evening, an unexpected phone call from the publishing company broke through my reverie. The editor on the other end was warm and enthusiastic. detailing the specifics of the position and emphasizing how eager they were to welcome me to the team. She describes it as a tremendous opportunity. We trust you will agree. I expressed my gratitude and promised to reach a decision shortly. However, as I ended the call, the burden of the choice ahead loomed heavily over me. That night, Ethan approached me, standing at the threshold of my study. What email? I feigned ignorance. The one about the job, he replied as he stepped inside. You're taking it, right? I sighed and placed my pen down. Ethan, this isn't centered on you. Naturally. It's centered around me, he declared, his voice escalating. You are escaping due to the events that transpired between us. I have decided to accept the position. It's an excellent opportunity, I asserted with confidence. It has nothing to do with you, I said. Stop lying. His response was laced with anguish. Eleanor, you seem utterly frightened. His comments sparked concern about others' perceptions and the depth of your feelings for me, causing me to look away, unable to hold his gaze. I replied, you're mistaken, though my tone betrayed a lack of certainty. Am I being challenged? Drawing nearer? Share your thoughts with me. It seems you don't harbor any feelings for me. Last night felt utterly devoid of significance. I parted my lips to respond. Yet no words came forth. The silence that enveloped us felt heavy and oppressive, prompting him to speak up. His tone softened. You might deceive yourself, but not me. Ethan left the room, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I glanced at the email on my computer screen, the cursor flickering as if it were waiting for my decision. I knew what I needed to do since the day I departed. The weather was dismal, with the sky overcast and a sense of weight in the air. I gathered my things quietly, not wishing to disrupt Ethan, who had been mostly silent since our last argument. I found myself wishing that this stillness signified his acceptance of things. The publishing business had organized a location agency to help me transition into my new home. As I lifted the last box into the car, I paused and glanced back at the house. Memories of the past months flickered through my mind like a film reel. The laughter, the discussions, and the stolen moments shaped our identity. Ethan stood in the doorway, hands tucked into his pockets, looking weary. The usual confidence he exuded had shifted to a softer, more vulnerable demeanor. You're really leaving, he said, his voice lacking any inflection. I nodded, contemplating my response. For whatever it may signify. He continued to draw nearer. I harbor no remorse for any of it. His words deeply affected me. I admitted that I don't feel the same way, barely able to raise my voice above a murmur. We lingered in silence, the unspoken words creating a heavy atmosphere around us. I reached out, my fingers lightly grazing his. Ethan, take care of yourself, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. You too, he replied, his voice thick with feeling. I yearned to express so much more. I attempted to express the depth of my feelings for him, yet the right words eluded me. Instead, I found myself in my car, driving away from the house filled with memories and the man I had come to love. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, and adjusting to my new life. The work was everything I had hoped for, challenging and fulfilling in ways I hadn't experienced in years. Yet, despite my busyness, I couldn't shake the pervasive emptiness. Occasionally, thoughts of Ethan would drift into my mind, wondering what he was doing, if he was content, and whether he thought of me as often as I thought of him. One evening, while wandering through the city, I stumbled upon a bookstore. its window showcasing a vibrant array of publications that beckoned to passers-by. My gaze was captured by a specific book. Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. And suddenly, the memories of that fateful day came rushing back, bringing a smile to my face. The book had been the catalyst, igniting a chain of events neither of us could have foreseen. I wandered inside, letting my fingers glide along the spines of the books as I meandered through the aisles. For a time, I let myself imagine an alternate version of our story, where the world was simpler and we could have been together free from fear or judgment. Yet, life unfolded differently, and happy endings were not assured. As the months and years went by, I held on to Ethan's memories like a cherished keepsake tucked away in a drawer. I didn't dwell on it, yet it remained a subtle presence, a touching reminder of life's core truths, the necessity of embracing risks, and the value of unconditional love amidst daunting obstacles. In retrospect, I realized that our connection transcended notions of right and wrong. It was fundamentally about our shared humanity and imperfections. Delicate and yearning for connection in a universe that seemed simultaneously vast and unwelcoming. And though our moments together were fleeting, they were authentic, they held significance.